Have you ever felt that kind of loneliness that doesn't seem to come from being alone, but from an emptiness that forms even when there are people around? That almost invisible sensation, like a constant background noise, that starts to become part of your routine without asking for permission. If you've ever felt something like that, perhaps this story will speak to you in a more intimate way than you imagine. And before skepticism makes you close this video, thinking it's just another random outpouring about loneliness, I invite you to stay because this is a story based on a psychologist's perspective on a patient's mind, and it has nothing to do with ready-made advice, shelf help, or motivational phrases, but something that saved her when even reality seemed to have given up: imagination. Back then, I lived in a big city, one of those that never sleeps, but also never listens. I woke up every day to the noise of buses, sirens, the neighbor shouting on the phone, and yet, the silence inside me was almost deafening. It's strange to say that deafening silence, but that's exactly what it is. It's that kind of internal noise that makes you doubt your own sanity, as if the world kept spinning, but you had fallen off its axis. I remember one specific day, one of those days that marked the beginning of a fall. It was raining non-stop, and the city seemed to reflect what I felt. People rushed by, protecting themselves with black umbrellas, all identical, as if part of a choreography of indifference. And I, on the other side of the window, saw myself reflected in the glass, wondering when I had stopped being part of that movement. Work didn't help. I went, did what needed to be done, replied as little as possible, and went back. The journey back was the worst. There was no one waiting for me. No sound besides the echo of my own footsteps in the building's hallway. And when I opened the door, the apartment seemed to breathe that cold, empty air, the kind of atmosphere that hugs you with a chilly discomfort. It was there, in that small, impersonal space, that I began to realize how creative or destructive loneliness can be, depending on how you choose to listen to it. I didn't have close friends, and my family lived far away. Virtual conversations, when they happened, were superficial, full of automatic phrases: "How are you? You've been missing. We need to make plans." No one ever made any plans. And it was in this absence of real contact that something began to form in my mind, a spark I didn't expect. It started with something simple. One night, unable to sleep, I picked up an old notebook. I always liked to write, but it had been years since I'd touched a pen without a professional purpose. I wrote a random phrase, without thinking too much: "Perhaps the world only exists when someone imagines it." And it kept echoing. It was as if, at that moment, I had turned on a small light inside the room. In the following days, this light became a kind of refuge. I began to create stories, not about myself, but about other lives, other possible realities. Characters who suffered, laughed, loved, and lost, but who always found a way to carry on. Gradually, I realized these creations weren't just distractions. They were attempts to stitch back a part of me I thought was lost. It's curious how the mind tries to survive when the heart no longer knows what to do. Imagination became my only company, but a powerful one. I didn't realize it yet, but I was rebuilding myself from the inside, even if almost unconsciously. However, before understanding this as a healing process, fear came. A strange fear, almost childish, of losing control. I began talking mentally to the characters I created, to miss them when I didn't write. And that scared me. I thought, am I going crazy? Perhaps you felt something similar, that point where the real and the imaginary touch in a dangerous way, like two lines that shouldn't cross, but do. That's when everything began to change. Because, instead of running from this mental confusion, I decided to embrace it. To accept that, perhaps, my salvation wasn't in forcing myself to face the real, but in allowing the unreal to guide me to a new understanding of myself. At this point, if you're still with me, it's important to say one thing. What I'm going to tell you from here on out isn't about escaping reality, but about reinventing it. About finding courage where no one else looks inside your own mind. So, if this story touches you, if you recognize yourself in any fragment of it, don't forget to comment below. I want to know if you, too, have ever had to invent a world to keep existing in your own. From then on, my nights were no longer empty. I would turn on a dim light, pick up the notebook, and write. Sometimes for hours. Other times, for minutes. I had no goal, no pretense. I just let it happen. And, curiously, each story I created seemed to give back a little piece of my own voice. It was as if, in the silence of the city, My imagination had started to speak for me. But of course, none of this happened smoothly. Because the deeper I dove into this invented universe, the more the real world seemed to distance itself. I began to forget appointments, to lose track of time, to feel that time passed differently. It was like living between two worlds, one that ignored me and one that welcomed me. And it was in this in-between that something extraordinary happened. One night, while writing about a character who lived alone in an old building, I heard a sound from the wall, a light, rhythmic knock, almost as if someone was responding to my writing. I froze. I waited. And the knock came again. In that instant, something in me awakened. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't completely alone. Of course, reason tried to intervene. It's just a pipe, it's the neighbor, it's the wind, but my heart refused to accept logical explanations. Because, in that exact moment, I wanted to believe there was something there. That perhaps my imagination had become so real it had started to echo beyond the mind. And that's where the story truly begins. That knock on the wall seemed like an insignificant detail, but, in the consulting room, it became the turning point. I remember the day the patient, let's call him A, walked through the door with sunken eyes, a pale face, and an air of someone carrying the weight of a secret. I had been seeing him for a few weeks, but, in that session, there was something different. The silence between one phrase and another seemed to pulsate. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "Doctor, I think what I create is starting to answer me." At first, I thought it was a metaphor. Many people use that kind of language when trying to describe deep emotions, imagination as a voice, fear as a shadow, sadness as someone who visits them. But there was something in the way A said it that didn't seem symbolic. He believed, in fact, that something or someone was on the other side of that wall. In psychology, there's a very fine line between creative elaboration and delusion. The first is a refuge, a healthy way of dealing with pain. The second, a desperate attempt by the unconscious to survive reality by breaking it. And, to understand which of the two it was, I needed to listen, truly listen. He told me how, on his nights of writing, he began to notice patterns. The knock always happened when he finished a specific sentence, as if there was an invisible communication. "I know it sounds crazy," he said, "but if I stop writing, the sound stops too. And sometimes, when I change the course of the story, it changes rhythm, as if it were disagreeing with me." There was fear in his voice, but also something that deeply intrigued me, a kind of silent hope. The human mind does that. It creates to survive, but sometimes what it creates becomes more real than the creator himself. I wanted to understand what was behind that knock. Was it just the echo of an exhausted mind, or something more symbolic, a physical representation of the desire to be heard? Over the course of the sessions, we kept going back to the point of origin: isolation. A lived alone, in a small apartment, without strong bonds. He described the city as a place that swallowed him in noises, but didn't listen to him. There was a contained sadness in every detail of his daily life. The sound of the elevator stopping on the wrong floor, the buzz of the pole outside, the clock he turned away so he wouldn't hear the seconds passing. Everything about him seemed to ask for silence, but loneliness forced him to create sounds where there was no life. Once, I asked him to describe how he felt when he heard the knock. He took a deep breath and replied, "It's as if someone were saying that I still exist." That phrase stayed with me for days. I wrote it down in my clinical notes notebook, but also in the other one, my personal notebook, where I keep the things that pierce me. Because that answer wasn't just clinical. It was human. The more he talked, the more I realized that what was at stake wasn't simply a case of isolation, but a form of creative survival. A wasn't using imagination as an escape. He was using it as a bridge, a fragile bridge, yes, but still an attempt to cross the abyss of absence. In the following weeks, he began bringing the texts he wrote. Stories about people who lived in buildings just like his, characters who heard voices, who knocked on walls waiting for an answer. There was a dark beauty in those pages, a kind of poetry between the lines, as if suffering had found a way to breathe through fiction. I listened to him and noted everything, but, deep down, something also began to change in me. It was as if the boundary between therapist and observer began to dissolve. Because, as he described his creations, I recognized echoes of myself, thoughts I'd had, sensations I'd felt, but never said out loud. One afternoon, A asked me, Do you believe imagination can save us? I stayed silent. As a psychologist, I knew what I should answer, that imagination is a coping resource, a symbolic tool to reorganize internal chaos. But, as a human being, I wasn't so sure. Because, if I were honest, I'd say that I too lived imagining parallel realities, small worlds where pain had a more bearable form. So I just answered, it depends on what you call salvation. He smiled, a brief smile, but a genuine one. Salvation is when the pain stops hurting. In that instant, I realized his imagination wasn't an escape. It was resistance, a way of fighting against disappearance. And then he did something unexpected. He said he had started leaving notes inside the walls. I remove a small piece of the plaster, put a folded paper inside, and close it back up, as if it were a letter to this other side. Clinical logic demanded I sound the alarm. That could indicate a deepening of the dissociation, a sign that the delusion was starting to take physical form. But the way he described it was different. Calm, almost ritualistic, as if he were participating in a kind of silent ceremony of reconnection. I asked to see one of these notes. He brought it the following week. It was a piece of yellowed paper, written by hand in a shaky script. If you really exist, please keep knocking. I need to believe I'm not alone. It was impossible not to feel a shiver. Not from the possibility of something supernatural, but from the depth of that gesture. It was a plea disguised as curiosity, a request for existence. In the next session, I asked him if the sound continued. He said yes, but now with different intervals, as if it were waiting for me to finish writing to answer. I tried to guide him toward a symbolic understanding of it. I talked about the unconscious, about how the mind creates echoes of itself to fill the void. He listened attentively, but then replied with something that undid me. Perhaps the unconscious only invents what the soul needs to hear. That phrase haunted me for nights. I started questioning if, at some level, that wasn't exactly what we all do. We invent voices, memories, entire worlds, just to keep breathing. And this is where the line begins to dissolve the boundary between who treats and who is treated. Because, as the patient dove deeper into his own creation, I also began to hear things. Not knocks, but echoes. Perhaps it was suggestion, perhaps just fatigue. But, one late night, rereading the session notes, I noticed something. One of the phrases he had written in a note, perhaps the world only exists when someone imagines it, was the same one I had found months before in a forgotten notebook in my drawer. A notebook I had written years ago, in a moment of profound loneliness. That's when I realized that this story perhaps wasn't just about him. And it's in this whirlwind that the true power of imagination begins to reveal itself. There's a subtle difference between understanding someone and starting to see them inside you. At first, I believed that listening to the patient attentively was an act of empathy, but I realized, with time, that something deeper and more dangerous was happening. When you listen to someone long enough, that person's voice begins to occupy quiet spaces in your mind. It settles in, whispers, answers. And I started to hear even when he wasn't there. The sessions had become long and dense. He talked, I took notes, but I no longer knew for sure if the words appearing on the page were his or mine. Once, at the end of a session, he looked at me fixedly and said, "Doctor, I think I know who's knocking on the other side of the wall." The way he said it, with an almost hypnotic serenity, left me speechless. I asked who it was, but he just replied, "Someone who writes with me." Those words reverberated in my head for days. And the more I tried to push the thought away, the more insistent it became. That same night, while reviewing my reports, I noticed a disturbing coincidence. I also wrote at night, at the same time he said he heard the knocks. During the following week, the sound returned. Not on the wall of my office, but in my own apartment. A faint, rhythmic knock, as if mimicking the pace of a breath. At first, I thought it was suggestion, a result of exhaustion. I was overloaded, emotionally drained, too immersed in the pain of others. But the sound persisted, even when I tried to ignore it. I wrote in my clinical diary, "The patient believes something answers his writing." And if, to some extent, this belief is shared, unconsciously, between us. Psychology calls this transference when a patient's emotions and patterns are projected onto the therapist. But there was something different this time. It wasn't just transference. It was symmetry. I started dreaming about AS texts. Vivid, almost cinematic dreams. I saw his stories come to life, characters walking the city streets, faces that looked like mine, apartments identical to mine. There was one detail that repeated. In all the dreams, I heard the same knock. Always 3 taps in a row, and then silence. I'd wake up sweating, confused, with the feeling that the real world was slightly misaligned. In the mirror, my reflection seemed delayed, as if the image took a second longer to follow me. Small things began to change: the position of objects, the smell of coffee, the light in the hallway. It was as if the environment had become conscious, reacting to me. In the next session, A asked me something that shattered me. "Doctor, have you ever felt like you were inside someone else's mind?" I was left without an answer. He continued, "It's just that, sometimes when I write, I feel as if someone is watching me, but not from the outside, from the inside. As if someone were creating me at the same time I imagine them." There was a frightening calm in his voice, a lucidity that defied any diagnosis. I tried to rationalize, but the frontier between clinical reality and subjective experience had already dissolved. I just asked, "And who do you think that person watching you is?" He replied, "You." The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. A weight in the air. I couldn't say anything, because, deep down, part of me believed it. In the following days, the feeling of mirroring increased. Everything he described seemed to find an echo in my own routine. When he talked about waking up tired, I also had sleepless nights. When he mentioned seeing shadows in the corner of the room, I saw them too. The boundary between who treated and who was treated was dissolving before me. In an effort to regain control, I started recording the sessions. I needed proof that this was real, that I wasn't hallucinating. Listening to the recordings later, I noticed something that chilled my blood. In several parts, between the speech, there was a low sound, 3 knocks, almost imperceptible. Always the same rhythm. I stopped listening to the tapes after the 3rd one. From then on, the sessions became a two-way mirror. Recounted his experiences with the knocks, and I took notes, but every word seemed a distorted reflection of my own experiences. He said the presence now felt like a constant companionship, a kind of energy that inspired him to write. I listened to him and, secretly, wished for the same a presence that would pull me from the stupor of the real, that would make me feel something again. By that point, it was no longer just a case study. It was an intimate coexistence between 2 tired minds trying to survive absence. There was one day, however, when everything changed definitively. He arrived at the office with an envelope. He said it was the last note he would leave in the wall. "After this, I don't think I'll need to write any more," he murmured. I asked to see the contents. It was a simple sheet, with a single sentence. "If you can hear me too, write back." That sentence hit me like a blow. On impulse, I replied, "What if I'm already writing?" He looked at me fixedly, and the silence that followed felt like a confirmation. That night, I wrote in my diary something I never had the courage to show anyone. I no longer know who is creating whom. Sometimes I think the patient is the author and I am the character. Other times, I believe we are both inventions of the same thought observing us from the outside. Imagination, I realized, isn't just a tool for escape. It is a living, autonomous force, capable of rebuilding realities when the old ones can no longer bear the weight of existence. And perhaps that is the true power we so try to understand: the mind's ability to recreate itself when everything else collapses. But there was still something I didn't understand. And what happened next surpassed any rational explanation. In the next session, A didn't show up. No notice, no message. I called, emailed, nothing. The next day, I went to his address. The superintendent said the apartment was locked, and that no one had seen him for days. It was then, in front of the closed door, that I heard it. 3 knocks. Dry, firm, identical to the ones echoing in my walls. And if you've ever lived through something that seemed like too much of a coincidence to be just chance, comment below. I want to know if you too have ever felt like reality was watching you back. The apartment door was locked. 3 knocks, the same precise sound, echoed from the other side as if responding to my presence. I waited, heart racing, ear pressed to the wood. No sound after that. No voice. Just the silence of a city that continued alive, indifferent, while something inside me shattered. I called the superintendent, asked him to open the door. He hesitated, but the look I must have been carrying convinced him. When we entered, the air had a metallic, cold smell, like a place that had held unspoken words. The apartment was simple, but every object seemed placed with obsessive precision, the books aligned, the pen on the desk, the notebook open. And that's what held me, the notebook. It was on the desk, with a single page written. The handwriting was A.S., but the sentence didn't seem directed at anyone, it seemed directed at me. If you've come this far, it's because the story has already chosen you. I closed the notebook with a mix of fear and fascination. I looked around, trying to understand what was happening. No signs of a struggle, no disorder. Just absence. The feeling was that he had dissolved, not fled, not disappeared, but simply ceased to exist on that plane. In the days that followed, silence took over the office. No new patients, no calls. The sound of the knocks ceased, but the void left behind was louder than any noise. I began rereading my reports, the notes, the excerpts from the recorded sessions. And, as I dove into that material, something frightening was revealed. Certain phrases, certain writing patterns, coincided with things I had recorded in my personal diary even before meeting A. It was as if our stories had been intertwined from the start, as if he were a projection, a form my mind found to translate what I myself didn't want to face. But there was one detail that couldn't be ignored. On one of the pages of the notebook he left behind, I found a date, March 14, 2017, the same day I had written, for the first time, the phrase, "Perhaps the world only exists when someone imagines it." The coincidence was impossible. I started to investigate. I scoured files, looked for his name in records, social media, any clue that confirmed A had existed outside my sessions. But nothing. No file, no payment history, no mention of him anywhere. It was as if I had invented that patient. And what if I had? That question began to haunt me. At first, I tried to rationalize perhaps some administrative error, perhaps memory lapses caused by stress. But, deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Because, the more I tried to prove he had existed, the more the world around me seemed to yield, as if it were rewriting itself to erase the evidence. I began to doubt my own sanity. My colleagues noticed my strange behavior, suggested I take a leave. I accepted. But time away from the office brought no relief. It brought more silence. The loneliness I once observed in others now inhabited me completely. And, in the midst of this void, imagination called to me again. At first, I resisted. But, one night, the impulse was stronger. I picked up A.S. notebook and started writing in the same tone, in the same shaky handwriting he used. I wrote what I felt, what I saw, what I remembered or thought I remembered. And, as the words accumulated, I noticed something. The more I wrote, the more the feeling of presence returned. The knocks started again. 3 taps. Pause. Another 3. This time, however, I felt no fear. I felt company. Perhaps that's what A had been trying to show me from the beginning, that imagination wasn't an escape, but a portal. A place where what was lost could continue to exist, even if in the form of reinvented memory. The days blended together. I wrote in the morning, read at night. I began to notice the text gained its own cadence, as if someone was completing it when I fell asleep. Certain words appeared on the pages without me remembering writing them. Entire sentences surfaced between my paragraphs, always in A.S. same handwriting. That's when I understood something that would change everything. The imagination wasn't mine. It was ours. 2 fragments of the same consciousness, trying to stay alive. And the more I accepted this, the more the real world became malleable. The city lights seemed to pulse to the same rhythm as the knocks. The sound of the subway, of footsteps, of rain, everything seemed to respond to something inside me. It was as if I had become part of a silent symphony that had always been there, waiting to be heard. But, along with this feeling of belonging, also came danger. Because, at the same time I felt alive, I began to lose the notion of where the mind ended and the world began. In a moment of lucidity, I returned to the office. I needed to record everything, give form to the chaos. I grabbed the recorder, turned it on, and started speaking, describing every detail: A's story, the knocks, the notebook, the coincidences. I spoke for hours. When I finished, I felt a weight lift from my chest. But, playing back the audio, I noticed something that froze me. My voice wasn't alone. Between my sentences, another voice, calm, identical to A's, said, "I knew you would write back." I deleted the file, but the sound kept echoing in my head. And that's when I understood. A was never just a patient. He was the personification of my own loneliness, a fragment of the mind that took form to force me to hear what I was trying to silence. The knock on the wall was the muffled scream of a part of me asking for recognition. And imagination, after all, was the only language that this pain knew how to speak. If you are listening to this story and feel that something inside you is also trying to communicate, don't ignore it. Sometimes, what we call madness is just the mind trying to find a poetic way to ask for help. I thought about ending everything there: the case, the notebook, the narrative. But something inside me stopped me. Because, even understanding that A was a creation, I still missed him. And longing, I realized, is the cruelest form of reality. And this is where the story changes direction, because what happens when imagination gains a will of its own, when what we invent begins to exist on its own, goes far beyond what science can explain. Stay with me until the end. Because what comes now is no longer about a patient, nor about a psychologist. It's about all of us and the invisible power that inhabits the silence between the real and the imaginary. If this story made you think, comment below. I want to know, how far would you go to not feel alone? The days after that discovery were strange. The city continued its indifferent rhythm, but I was no longer in it in the same way. Everything seemed folded, duplicated, as if space and time had acquired a different texture, more malleable. The streets that once swallowed me now seemed to pulse with a cadence I could hear, understand, almost anticipate. A's notebook was on the desk. I hesitated before touching it, feeling the responsibility of handling something that, in a way, was more than pages and ink. It was the physical manifestation of a fragment of my own mind. Opening it, I noticed new phrases had appeared, ones I didn't remember writing. And among them, one particularly clear. When we accept our imagination as a bridge, no loneliness can consume us. It was in that moment that I understood the depth of what was happening. Imagination wasn't an escape. It was a tool for survival, a mechanism of resilience that allows the mind to rebuild itself even when everything around seems to be crumbling. For weeks, I began to experiment. I wrote with full awareness that I wasn't alone. Each word became a dialogue, not with someone external, but with parts of me that had previously remained silent. The loneliness didn't disappear, but it changed form. It stopped being an oppressive void and became a space for creation. I started observing my own routine with different eyes. The city's noise, which was once a constant reminder of indifference, now became the soundtrack to a world that could be reinvented. Each imagined knock on the wall, each sound of footsteps, rain, or wind became a note in a symphony I was learning to conduct. I remember one night in particular. The apartment was silent, just the distant sound of a subway and the buzz of the pole outside. I picked up the notebook and started writing with no defined goal. The words flowed almost automatically, forming stories within stories, characters that reflected my own doubts and hopes. And then, I realized, I was smiling. A smile that hadn't appeared in a long time. Human resilience, I learned, isn't manifested only in facing reality head-on. Sometimes, it reveals itself in the courage to invent a new reality, even if temporary, even if only within one's own mind. Because, in creating, you reinvent the self that seemed lost, you give voice to the silence that seemed impossible to fill, and you find company where there was once only absence. Over the weeks, I noticed my relationship with A had also changed. He had become, at the same time, my reflection and my guide. I learned to listen without fear, to write without hesitation, to feel without needing an explanation. The patient who may never have existed outside the imaginary taught me something vital, that the mind has invisible ways of saving itself, and that these ways don't need to be understood by others to work. The notes, the knocks, the voices, they all became symbols that even in the darkest moments, when reality seems insufficient, there is something inside us capable of building bridges to a safe place. A place where pain is recognized, but doesn't dominate. where loneliness is transformed into dialogue, even if it's just between fragments of ourselves. And then I realized something else. It wasn't just my mind that was saving itself. Every reader, every viewer following this story, can experience the same. Because imagination is democratic, invisible, and powerful. It gives us the right to create worlds, explore emotions, and find ourselves in places that reality often refuses. If you are listening to this now, you know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you felt the absence of someone, the distance of an indifferent world, the impossibility of being fully understood. And yet, perhaps you too have the chance to save yourself. Not with ready-made formulas, not with motivational phrases, but with the courage to invent, to imagine, to be whole, even if only inside your mind. Imagination saved me, and it continues to save me. It is an invisible, silent tool, but with unparalleled power. It allowed me to understand that sanity isn't measured only by contact with objective reality, but by the ability to create and inhabit worlds that keep us alive when everything else seems insufficient. Today, loneliness still exists. The city still roars. But I learned to walk within my own parallel universe, to dialogue with the echoes of my mind, to write invisible letters to worlds only I can see. And, in this process, I realized that true strength isn't in resisting absence or pain, but in accepting imagination as a refuge and, at the same time, as a powerful weapon of emotional survival. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the strength of your own mind, leave a comment. Share this video with someone you feel needs to hear this. Like it so more people can discover that, even in the deepest loneliness, there is an invisible tool capable of saving. And, above all, subscribe to keep following stories that explore human power in unexpected ways. Because, in the end, salvation didn't come from facing raw reality. It came from the courage to invent a new reality, the courage to imagine, and, in that invention, I rediscovered the life I believed I had lost. And perhaps you can too.